Hola, hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos a el conversatorio que tendremos hoy sobre estándar de vida digna. Hoy, martes 21 de noviembre, nos acompaña Abigail Davis, que es codirectora del Center for Research in Social Policy en la Universidad Loughborough University. Y también nos acompaña la doctora Laura Valadez-Martínez, que es investigadora y profesora de política social en Loughborough University. Asimismo, está también conectada Cristian Molina y es profesora e investigadora del TEC de Monterrey y coanfitriona de esta sesión. Estaremos moderando la segunda parte en donde tendremos preguntas y respuestas. Quisiera nada más hacer un par de avisos. Vamos a iniciar nuestra sesión hoy viendo un video. Es un video que grabamos al principio de este proceso de la investigación del estándar de vida digna. Se grabó hace algún tiempo y el video es un gran recuento y un buen detalle de cómo funciona la metodología que se está siguiendo. Ahí vendrá explicado. En el video van a notar que está Matt Padley, que es co-director con Abby allá en la Universidad de Loughborough. Entonces, él participará con nosotros a través del video. Y al terminar el video, iniciaremos primero con una presentación de la doctora Cristian Molina, que nos actualizará en cómo va la investigación que se está haciendo actualmente. Y a partir de ahí abriremos a preguntas y respuestas. El video está en inglés. La conversación que tendremos posterior al video es en inglés, pero siéntanse en total libertad de hacer preguntas en español y nosotros nos encargamos de hacer la traducción en el momento con nuestras panelistas. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, les voy a compartir mi pantalla para ver el video.
Hello, and welcome to our conversation today about minimum income standard, MIS, also known as MIS. Today, we're joined by Abigail Davis and Matt Padley, who are co-directors of the Center for Research in Social Policy in Loughborough University in UK. We're also joined by Cristian Molina, who is a research director in the Conscious Enterprise Center of Tecnológico de Monterrey. And I am Carlos Garza, director of Iniciativa, Capitalismo Social from Centro Eugenio Garzazada. So we would like to kick off our conversation today with Cristian. See you.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos. Thanks, Abby and Matt, for being here. It has been a wonderful couple of days together with you. So I would like for you to perhaps speak to us about what is the minimum income standard methodology and what are the origins, right? So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us. We've had an amazing time. It's been great working with you and all your colleagues. So the minimum income standard is something that came about, some research that came about from the early 2000s. There were a couple of approaches of ways of looking at what people needed as a minimum. And each approach had its strengths, but also its flaws. And minimum income standard was born out of two different methods, one of which was looking at expenditure data, looking at expert input to decide what a certain household type needed. Our approach at Loughborough was something called the consensual budget standards approach, where rather than experts and survey data, we asked people, members of the public, to come together and discuss what they thought was needed for somebody in order to have a suitable standard of living. But as I said, each had flaws in their methodology. We felt that the expenditure data expert-led didn't really take into account people's lived experiences. We know that expenditure data tells you what people spend money on, but we know people on very constrained incomes don't have all the money they need, so they're having to go without things. So looking at what they've spent on doesn't show you what they need, it just shows you what they've been able to afford. It doesn't tell you what they've gone without or what difficult decisions they've had to make and what that means to them. The consensual method has a lot of strengths and is grounded very much in lived experience, but with the best will in the world, lay people cannot be expected to be able to look at a week's worth of nutrition and know that it has the right level of macronutrients and micronutrients to meet government health guidelines. So some expert input is useful in that. Similarly, when thinking about heating your home or cooking and using domestic energy, people can't be expected to know how much is required in terms of, in a technical way, in terms of thermal units or kilowatt hours. So again, we had some expert input with that. So we used the expert input from the Family Budget Unit and the Consensual Budget Standards methodology that we'd been working on at Loughborough, and brought those two together, and that became the minimum income standard, where we bring groups of members of the public together to think about what somebody in the same demographic group as them would need in order to have a minimum socially acceptable standard of living.
So, again, harping on socially acceptable, and I would also like to maybe expand upon the relevance of members of the public coming to a consensus about what is socially acceptable and what is not.
Yeah. So the key question in all of the minimum income standard research is identifying how much is enough. So what do people need for that minimum socially acceptable standard of living? What does a socially acceptable standard of living look like, and how do we arrive at a definition of that, a description of that? And why ask the public? All of those are entirely reasonable questions. So the key question, as I said, is how much is enough? How do we answer that question? Well, we get groups of members of the public together. And at the start of the research back in 2006, we got all sorts of different groups of people together to think about how that minimum socially acceptable standard of living should be defined. And that has been central to everything that we've done since then. So for the past 14 years, all the research we've done has used the same definition, which came from the public, of that minimum socially acceptable standard of living. And I normally get it wrong. But a minimum standard of living in the UK today includes, but is more than just food, clothes and shelter. It's about having what you need in order to have the opportunities and choices to participate in society. So that's the definition of a minimum socially acceptable standard of living. And within that, there's the things you'd expect. So there's food, clothes and shelter. And those things are critical for survival everywhere, globally. But within the UK, groups at the start of this process also emphasised the importance of being able to participate in the world around you and being able to have choices. So not being able to just do one thing, but being able to take part in a range of different sorts of activities, to have access to different sorts of things. So this is not about finding a line that is about subsistence or just existing. It's about feeling part of the society in which you live.
Just if you can help us understand, like maybe in a very macro sense, like what do? Like you get the members of the public together, you come up with a definition, then. So I don't know if we don't have to go into all the detail of the methodology, but I think it helps to understand how you come up with the final answer.
So it's an iterative process. And so you have the definition. We also use something we refer to as case studies, which is just an example of somebody in that category. So we bring together groups of retired people to talk about the needs of someone who is retired, or the need parents to talk about the needs of parents and children, and so on. So they're working with an example of somebody like that. And we bring together people from across a range of income groups and different backgrounds. And that's really important to what we do, because we're trying to build consensus across society. We're not doing a survey of what people on low incomes think their life is like. We're not doing a survey with affluent people of what they think poorer people need. We're looking to get people to agree and discuss and negotiate on what everybody in our society should be able to have as a minimum, on the understanding that everybody in the group is different. Some people may be living at that level, some people may be below it, some people may be above it. But what they can agree on is a benchmark below which no one should fall. So we bring them together. They have lots of in-depth discussions about what somebody might need, the goods and services to have this standard of living in line with our definition. And we ask them not only what it is, but why that's needed. So we understand a great deal about why each item is in the budget and what quality it should be and how long it will last, and why the cheapest version isn't appropriate because it will fall apart too quickly, or the towels will just will not last as long as people think they should do, or whatever the item is. And we take all of that away, turn it into lists, capture all the data from those long discussion groups, and then take it to a fresh set of people who then inspect it, go through all the detail, resolve any issues, fill in any gaps. And each time they're looking at things, and this is a fresh set of people. So they've never seen these lists before. They weren't involved in drawing them up in the first place. And they're looking at what they know of everyday life to assess whether there's something in there that doesn't belong, that's too luxurious, or that what's been provided is not adequate for someone to have a dignified life. And they make adjustments. We bring in the expert input and feed that into groups about any changes to the nutritional balance that the nutritionist would suggest. But that's for the groups to accept or reject. And then some further stages of groups fill in any remaining holes or gaps, or deal with any outstanding issues, give us more detail where we need it, and assess the budget as a whole. And that's the end of the process for that time. And we do that over and over again. Every 2 years, we're doing new primary research with fresh sets of people to assess it for changes over time. And every 4 years to completely start from scratch to capture all the details and the nuance of what they think, because it's very important that it's based in the world we recognise now, and not one that goes more and more out of date over time. And that's why we keep doing it. And by bringing in new people in every stage of groups, every time we do it, we're broadening that consensus. There are more and more people that have been involved in this process.
Thank you so much for this overview of the methodology. I think it helped us understand, and for me, the key points were the needs, the focus on the needs, and that the data is collected from the people, right? Not imposed but by any expert or any other process. So thank you so much for that. I would like to perhaps discuss a little bit about the applications, right? Now that we understand a little bit of the methodology, how can we use this technique and the results and the information that we get from applying this methodology?
Yeah. So what this research does is essentially establish a threshold, a benchmark below which different sorts of households, depending on their composition, below which they can't have that minimum standard of living. Ultimately, this all comes down to a number. So what is it that a retired couple need in order to have a minimum socially acceptable standard of living each week? What do a lone parent and 2 children need in order to have that standard of living? And that, in the UK is a number in pounds each week that they need to have that living standard. We can do all sorts of things with that. One of the things we can do, and we do this regularly, is to look at how many people in the UK live above or below that standard. So currently in the UK, around 30% of the population live below that minimum income standard. So they don't have everything they need for a minimum socially acceptable standard of living. And that varies by demographic groups. For lone parents, it has been as high as 70% of lone parents not having what they need for a minimum standard of living. So we can use it in that general way to look at what's going on with incomes broadly. But we can also apply it in a range of different ways, and it has been used in a surprising number of ways, I think. When we started this research in 2006, we weren't sure that anyone was ever going to use it. And now it's being used across society in lots and lots of ways. So within the UK, charities who support people on low incomes use it in order to make decisions about who they support financially or the level of financial support that they provide. And it's been used by a wide range of different organisations to do that. It's used by some housing providers within the UK to adjust rents. So adjusting rents, bearing in mind and taking into account the incomes that people have and where that puts them relative to what they need as a minimum. Its largest use within the UK has been as the basis for the real living wage. So establishing what people need as a minimum and then using that information for different demographic groups to calculate what workers need in order to have that living standard. And that real living wage in the UK is now paid by 10,000, or is it reached 11,000? 10 or 11,000 employers. And that's different to the statutory minimum wage, which unhelpfully or confusingly is called the national living wage in the UK. But that's a voluntary wage paid by employers who recognise the benefit of paying their workers a wage that is based on and rooted in all of these discussions and this kind of shared vision of the society that we want.
But perhaps digging deeper into that, because this methodology helps us understand all the needs, does it necessarily have to focus on, let's say, the wages, I don't know, like the what the employers are paying, or does it reflect other, I don't know, benefits or other types of compensation that are not necessarily perhaps cash?
Yeah. So the minimum income standard, it sets that benchmark. What it does, if we're taking a step back, is provide a kind of shared vision of the kind of society that we want, the kind of lives that we want everyone to be able to live in the UK. And there are many ways of helping people towards having that living standard. It isn't just about how much money people earn, because there are people who are unable to work, and we need to take account of that. So it's not just about earnings, it's not just about wages. There are lots of things we can do to address the costs that have a direct impact on what it is that people need for that minimum living standard. So childcare is a really good example. Childcare is a significant cost to lots of families within the UK. And often going out to work doesn't bring in, or all of that money is used up paying for childcare. So one way we can start to address living standards or help more people to reach that minimum living standard is by doing something to address that cost. Public transport. The cost of public transport, and we know this from work we do in London, looking at what people need for a minimum in London. Public transport takes up a massive amount of people's minimum budget, or contributes a lot to that, setting where that line is. What could we do to address the cost of public transport? What can, in terms of public policy, what policy decisions can we make that will reduce those costs? So it's not all about wages. It's not all about the emphasis is not all on employers to do something about it. It's on politicians, it's on business leaders to work together to address both sides of that, both the income side and the cost side.
Yeah, just on that note, and maybe taking even a further step back, and this could be for both of you, maybe just like philosophically, I would like to ask like different members of society, how you think or how you've seen that they've understood this myth, and I would ask about members of government, business leaders, civil society, or society at large.
I think there's something really interesting. There was a piece of work done in the UK with living wage employers and their employees to look at what difference it made to be an accredited living wage employer. This is with the voluntary one that's based on minimum income standard. And they found that there were various benefits, not just the fact that their employees were on a higher income, but that employees felt more valued, they were more likely to be more productive, they had greater staff retention, which obviously cuts a lot of costs in terms of recruitment, and also in terms of how the employer was viewed, their kind of reputation, the sort of institutional reputation, because being able to say that you were an accredited living wage employer was seen that you were a kind of an ethical organisation and a good employer that would be good to work for. So in terms of, that's a kind of a very real example of how that minimum income standard work by informing that living wage actually is sort of understood as a greater good, if you like, sort of not just for the people that work there, but for the employers as well.
If we're taking a step back and thinking about what this research does and how it can be used, it does provide that kind of shared understanding of the world we want for politicians. It doesn't necessarily follow, sadly, that anything is done about that, or that the response is to suddenly improve everything for everyone. But it does set out, and because we do it, we regularly update it and we repeat it, it continues to set out that shared vision, which could form the basis of lots of public policy decisions. So around, not just around costs and incomes, but around the way in which cities are organised, the way in which people access work, get to work, walkable spaces. It could have an impact beyond just thinking about the resources, I guess, that people need. That kind of, I guess, public goods rather than private goods. For business leaders, as Abby was saying, there's lots of evidence to suggest that if you kind of take on this shared vision of the world we want, the society we want, and take that on in a very practical way by paying the real living wage, that there are benefits not only to the people you're employing, because they're more likely to be able to reach this minimum living standard, but to you as an employer. For civil society, it acts as a way of shaping their thinking about the way the world could be, and how we move towards that. And on an individual level, we know that lots of people kind of engage with the work that we do and use it in their thinking about what sort of life they want. So there's, there are lots and lots of different uses of it, many of which we can't control, and they're not always positive. It's worth saying that, but it does kind of, yes, it sets out in great detail how many pairs of socks you need and how many saucepans you need and how many times you need to go out every week. So it's that kind of minute detail. But if you do take a step back, it does provide that kind of shared understanding of what living with dignity in the UK today means. And that's a really powerful tool in lots of different conversations.
I think there's some other really great examples of how useful it's been, sort of, practical applications. One of them is to do with the legal system, where the government introduced fees for industrial tribunals, which meant that thousands of people were unable to afford to actually seek justice. And MIS was used as part of the evidence to explain why that made it unaffordable, and therefore that was unfair. And the introduction of the fees was overturned, and thousands of people were reimbursed, and the number of claims that were able to be made as a result of that being overturned significantly rose. So it's really good to know that we have increased the access to justice for people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford it. The Scottish Government are using it in their thinking about monitoring fuel poverty, because having looked at various different ways of measuring things and assessing them, they decided that the minimum income standard, because it's based in public opinion and because it's regularly updated and is considered to be robust, gave them a better way of informing those that thinking about fuel poverty monitoring than other possible ways of doing it.
Because of the way MIS is constructed, and you've been talking about how you do it, there's necessarily a difference between MIS and other indicators like minimum wages or average income for a household. So can you talk a little bit about how it's been misunderstood or maybe misused in the past so that we can try to avoid those pitfalls?
I think one of the ways in which it gets misused most frequently is people thinking about it as a poverty line. So confusing discussions around minimum living standards with discussions around what end up being reasonably abstract lines that we choose. So within the UK and for that matter internationally, poverty is often thought of as a proportion of median income. So in the UK, if you're below 60% of median income, you're living in poverty. That doesn't tell you anything particularly about what living standards are like under that line. It's a fairly arbitrary line, and MIS has been, talked about as a kind of poverty measure. Actually, MIS is almost the opposite. It's not about what you lack; it's about what you need, and it identifies what you need in order to have that living standard.
So you've been doing this for 16 years now. 16. You've been all around the world. Talking about MIS and also implementing MIS. So if you were to talk to Matt and Abby from 16 years ago, what would you tell them? Just if you could tell them
Do it. Run.
a little bit about the importance of persevering, because you said earlier that you didn't really know what was going to happen when you started. So some of us are in that stage right now. So why is perseverance with these types of investigations important?
It's so rewarding. There's something almost magical, not to get too excited, but when you see a group in action and you know they've got it and they're moderating themselves, they're doing that thing of negotiating, reminding each other it's not about survival, it's about participation. They're really taking on the case of the case study and kind of going, well, they need this thing because if they don't have that, then they'll be, miserable, or their mental health will be affected. It's really important. They're not thinking about themselves. They're not viewing it in a selfish, individualistic way. They're not saying they must have this because I have this or because I want this. They are thinking about that individual and the life that they are having. And that is brilliant. So I love that, and watching that come together and the way that it plays out is brilliant. And how invested people are and how engaged they are is kind of quite heartwarming in a way that people are willing to really engage in that way and give up their time and think about it so seriously. So all of that, it's worth persisting because what it gives you is valuable, because it is robust, because it gives you so much more than just the survey or just the expenditure data. In an understanding of the society that you have and people's opinions about that and what it should be. So for all of those reasons, it's a roller coaster.
I think I said we didn't know what was going to happen, and we didn't know if it was going to have an impact. And I think one of the most rewarding things, and one of the things that makes it worth keeping on doing this is the ways in which it has been used to make people's lives better, and to improve the living standards of people in the UK. And our hope is that continues globally. The fact that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the UK who are being paid more because of the work that we do, that makes sitting in a cold room in Derby for 6 hours absolutely worth it, because of the impact that our work has. When people get in touch with us to tell us how they're using it, because often we're unaware of these things, when charities get in touch and say, we couldn't do the work that we do without you doing the work that you do, thank you very much. That makes it enormously rewarding.
So we're definitely very excited about starting our own journey using this methodology. And I think as you, we are driven also by the potential impact that we can have in the lives of many people. But it's great to see that even like the participants also, they have also the well-being of the society in mind. So it's really completely aligned to the purposes of both our centers. So thank you very much for being together with us and talking to us a little bit more about the MIS methodology and what you have been doing in the UK. And well, hopefully we will meet again and discuss further and perhaps also bring some of the results that we are going to have here in Mexico and Monterrey in particular in upcoming months. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. And thank you for watching, and stay tuned because very soon we're going to be speaking about some results. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por su atención y pues bueno, ahora queremos platicarles un poco acerca de lo que ha pasado desde esa reunión que ya fue hace algunos meses y pues déjenme preparar nada más unos slides de apoyo. Un segundo y comienzo a compartir. Muy bien. Bueno, como lo escucharon al inicio, este proyecto lo hemos titulado Estándar de Vida Digna y queremos platicarles en qué hemos avanzado hasta este mes de noviembre. Es una presentación muy corta porque queremos aprovechar todo el tiempo para preguntas y respuestas, de manera que podamos entender mucho mejor pues, la metodología de estudio que estamos utilizando. Básicamente me gustaría describirles el proyecto, los avances y darles un poco de un vistazo, una pincelada a los hallazgos que tenemos hasta ahora. Como también se mencionaba en el video, el objetivo de esta investigación es generar un conocimiento actualizado, eso creo que es muy importante, de las necesidades que tienen los miembros de un hogar mexicano hipotético para vivir una vida digna. Con base en esas necesidades, en ese gran listado de necesidades, somos capaces de generar un presupuesto y pues tener una línea base del costo de ese estándar de vida, ese estándar de vida digna. Y a su vez, se puede utilizar para toma de decisiones en diferentes públicos o para diferentes situaciones. Y también se puede utilizar para medir el impacto de las iniciativas que se puedan desplegar en torno al tema. Me gustaría, pues brevemente también decirles cómo vamos. Son una serie de etapas que van permitiendo avanzar en ese listado de las necesidades de este hogar o de esta familia hipotética. Asimismo, también estas etapas nos permiten tocar base con expertos que nos puedan también pues dar algunos inputs para generar también los presupuestos, ¿no? Comentarles también que este estudio lo estamos haciendo en 6 ciudades de México, como podrán ver de pronto en la pantalla, y en el primer gráfico, en el gráfico que se muestra en la parte superior, podrán ver entonces que ya estamos básicamente a la mitad del proceso. Con base en estos hallazgos, o más bien los hallazgos de este estudio, nos permitieron refrescar la definición de vida digna. Esta definición no parte de este estudio, sino que ya viene de 2 estudios previos, un estudio piloto en el que participó la doctora Laura Valadez, también con personas del Centro de Estudio de Política Pública y Social de la Universidad de Loughborough. Y bueno, con base en esos hallazgos, nosotros también pues volvimos a preguntarle al público qué significa una vida digna, qué necesidades se tienen que satisfacer como mínimo para vivir una vida digna. Y la definición varió un poquito, hay algunos cambios, quizás son ligeros, pero también tiene una gran profundidad, como lo van a ver en un momento. Entonces, en México, en nuestro estudio indica que una vida digna requiere satisfacer la alimentación, la vivienda digna, la vestimenta y demás necesidades básicas, así como tener la oportunidad de tener un buen trabajo, acceso a los servicios de salud y educación de calidad y el tiempo libre. Se trata también de estar comunicado e informado, vivir en un entorno estable y seguro y ser parte de la sociedad. Ahora me gustaría entrar en cada una de estas categorías para comentar y quizás darle voz a esos participantes que estuvieron con nosotros en las sesiones de grupo. Por ejemplo, en el caso de un buen trabajo, ¿qué significa un buen trabajo para estas personas que han participado en el estudio? En primer lugar, pues decían que sea un trabajo que te guste hacerlo, pero obviamente también tiene que ver con el salario. Algunos nos decían que sea un trabajo bien pagado, que ayude a cubrir esos gastos y necesidades, bueno, relacionadas a la vida digna. También un tema que surgía al hablar del buen trabajo tiene que ver con el horario laboral y la flexibilidad. En particular también en no depender de pues el ingreso de hora extra para poder satisfacer las necesidades de esa vida digna. Entonces, por ejemplo, participantes nos dijeron que tampoco es justo que trabajes más de tus 8 horas, que andes trabajando de 12 hasta 15 horas, pues no, con referencia a lo que tendrían ellos que trabajar para poder cubrir sus necesidades, ¿no? Incluso pues llegan a mencionar las prestaciones, los beneficios que reciben, hasta temas de capacitación, y bueno, ahí podrán leer también algunos de otros extractos de estas sesiones. En términos de vivienda, el estudio hasta la fecha ha arrojado que las necesidades van cambiando conforme la familia va creciendo, pero también este estudio y las participaciones de las personas que conformaron estos grupos nos dicen que pues también la vivienda actualmente de pronto no cubre esas necesidades para esa familia. Por ejemplo, en este caso de 4, que nos mencionaba un participante, donde habla del tamaño de la vivienda y la necesidad de que el espacio sea un poco más grande para poder pues darle el espacio requerido, ¿no? En términos de necesidades básicas, es muy interesante que, por ejemplo, el tema del agua, sabemos que ha habido problemas y hay estrés hídrico en diferentes regiones de México, entonces el agua, el acceso a drenaje, el acceso a otros servicios públicos como luz, gas, pues también se contempla dentro de esa categoría. En alimentación se habla de una comida saludable, pero también variada. Y aquí como nada más una mención, pues nosotros estamos ahí consultando con un experto en nutrición del área de Tech Salud para poder también tener todas las recomendaciones integradas en esos presupuestos que vamos a estar pues produciendo próximamente. En términos de educación, también de manera interesante, como vieron en la definición, se hace énfasis a que la educación sea de calidad. Es decir, por ejemplo, que como nos comenta un participante, que los maestros se comprometan, pero también es un tema del acceso, del cupo que tienen disponible y la cantidad de escuelas, entonces en ese caso es importante, ¿no? Incluso las condiciones de la escuela misma, la infraestructura con la que cuentan también tiene relevancia. Y en términos del servicio médico, aparte de tener acceso a poder llevar una consulta con un médico, se habla también del acceso a las medicinas, porque pues no se puede una sin la otra, ¿no? Y el equipamiento y la cantidad de hospitales disponibles. En términos de tiempo libre, las personas refieren el tiempo libre para utilizarlo para estar en familia, pero también aquí surgen temas como las vacaciones, personas que nos dicen, bueno, pues ir de vacaciones, pues también sería incluido porque pues, muy pocas personas vamos de vacaciones y si acaso una vez. Otras actividades recreativas también como el deporte se asocian con esa categoría. En conectividad nos hablan del internet, por ejemplo, como una necesidad básica, porque si no sale más caro no tener este servicio, o bien en el caso de la telefonía móvil como que algo que ya es indispensable porque ya no existe también otras formas de comunicación como los teléfonos estacionarios. En términos de transporte es muy interesante que aquí van variando aparentemente las necesidades y a lo que se refirieron muchos de los participantes fueron a las condiciones precarias de pronto que pues los obligan a buscar tal vez otras formas de transporte que pudieran llegar incluso a ser tal vez eventualmente más costosas, ¿no? Y pues bueno, pues para que pasemos a las preguntas y respuestas, también me gustaría pues invitarlos a seguir sintonizados con este estudio y seguramente los estaremos contactando con los próximos pasos, pero desde ya les adelanto que próximamente, a finales de noviembre, la próxima semana, se estará liberando un libro que también es un esfuerzo de otras instituciones y en el cual pues estamos nosotros aportando pues también un capítulo con la definición de vida digna. Y los invito entonces a mantenerse en contacto. Por ahí pues tendrán mi correo electrónico y cualquier cosa también a través de nuestros aliados del Centro Eugenio Garza Sada. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Cristian. Y empezamos con preguntas y respuestas. Quisiera empezar con Laura, dado que a Laura no la hemos escuchado todavía, la doctora Laura Valadez-Martínez. Laura Cecilia Carrillo nos pregunta, muchas de las características de vida digna tienen que ver con servicios que presta el gobierno, por ejemplo, agua, medicamentos, transporte, etcétera. En su opinión, ¿cuál es el papel de las empresas en esto?
¿Qué tal? Muchas gracias. Gracias por la presentación y por la actualización del proyecto. Primero quiero darle la enhorabuena por los avances, porque da gusto ver todos los avances y gracias, Cristian, por compartirnos los comentarios de las personas. Es una pregunta muy buena la que nos hacen sobre el papel del gobierno y el papel de las empresas en este sentido. Sin duda hay una interacción entre el gobierno, la iniciativa privada y la sociedad civil también. en la educación, en la salud. Como lo vimos en el video, la metodología se basa en explicar, o según lo que dice la gente, cuáles son las necesidades para vivir una vida digna. Y después es un paso siguiente, una conversación sobre quién provee qué, cuál es el papel de la empresa, cuál es el papel del gobierno, cuál es el papel de las familias, de la iglesia, de la sociedad civil. Entonces, las empresas juegan un papel fundamental en tener este diálogo con el gobierno. No puede existir el uno sin el otro. Entonces, en educación, en salud, se requiere esta conversación, pero para poder tener la conversación necesitamos saber de qué estamos hablando, de qué es ese nivel de vida digno que estamos hablando, qué es lo que ha dicho la gente, qué es una calidad de trabajo, qué es una calidad de educación, cuáles son las necesidades de transporte, cómo encaja eso con los horarios laborales, cómo encaja eso con las necesidades de tiempo y de recreación de los niños, ¿no? Entonces, el papel de la empresa pues es fundamental, creo yo, en el diálogo constante con el gobierno y con la sociedad civil, porque de forma independiente ninguno lo podría lograr.
Gracias, Laura. For the next question, Abigail, Karen Aguilar wants to know if these methodologies consider environmental aspects as well, like, for example, air quality or water sufficiency or those types of stuff, because all of that is part of a dignified living standard as well. You're in mute, Abby.
Apologies, and thank you so much for having me. That's a really good question. It's one that we're going to look at in more detail in the next few years. We have plans to look at what people need for La Vida Digna, but with a view to what would be more sustainable choices and what cost that would have. So a slightly different take on the environmental question. A lot of that, though, is very similar to what we were talking about in the video about what services are provided. So if there isn't good quality drinking water, the budgets would need to enable people to have enough to buy bottled water. If that is what's considered the standard and a realistic sort of way that you access fresh water, they would need to take that into account. So it's very much about what groups say is required. I know there have been conversations about air conditioning, which becomes very pertinent in places like Monterey, where it does get very hot, and global warming is making everything hotter. And those are conversations. This is another reason why it's something we need to regularly revisit, because that may change as the planet heats. We may find that there is more of a need for those ways of mediating those extremes. So it's taken into account in as much as if participants bring that to the group in a way that means there is a cost implication that the budgets need to take into account, then yes, it is covered. If it's felt that those things don't have an additional cost implication, or that the quality of what is provided or what is accessible is okay without a financial outlay, then that is assumed to be available to all already. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Abby, and thank you for the answer. Cristian wants to comment as well.
Sí, y quizá refiriéndome a esa pregunta, también me gustaría agregar que de pronto tal vez no específicamente se preguntan, digamos, temas ambientales. En realidad dejamos que toda esta definición surja de los participantes, pero sí me gustaría señalar, por ejemplo, que sí vimos que surge mucho este tema, por ejemplo, del agua cuando conducimos los grupos en Monterrey, pero en lugares como Veracruz, donde reciben noticias acerca del estrés hídrico que hay en Monterrey, también ya las personas empiezan a buscar cómo prever un poquito más, y entonces esto se va a reflejar no necesariamente tal vez en la descripción de la vida digna, pero en las necesidades. Por ejemplo, en las necesidades de vivienda, hablar de tener un tinaco o contar con una cisterna para poder enfrentar de pronto algún corte de este servicio que es vital, ¿no? Entonces, si bien no está explícitamente, pues en las preguntas que hacemos, sí ha surgido de los participantes al tener ese conocimiento, pues, de la necesidad, por ejemplo, y la escasez de agua, ¿no?
Gracias, Cristian. Giselle Rentería quiere saber cómo se seleccionaron estas ciudades o estados donde está haciendo la investigación y hace una pregunta relacionada. Escuchamos primero a Cristian, pero abro la pregunta porque la pregunta que hace Giselle habla de las diferencias entre las ciudades, o sea, que los servicios, la educación, las opciones que requieren las diferentes poblaciones son distintas. Entonces, no sé, Cristian, si quisieras tú hacer algún comentario primero sobre la selección y luego podemos comentar acerca de las diferencias geográficas.
Sí, de alguna manera buscamos también tener como un punto de referencia porque, bueno, como decía mientras presentaba la definición, el estudio no es un estudio, digamos, que es nuevo. En ocasiones anteriores se hizo este piloto en el que participó Laura y posteriormente se publicó en el 2020 un estudio por el Centro Espinosa Iglesias y nosotros buscábamos tener, digamos, esa base para poder comparar y ver también cómo ha cambiado un poco pues ese costo de vida o las necesidades, la descripción y demás. Buscamos también agregar algunas ciudades en las que de pronto hubiera alguna diferencia, por ejemplo, en temas de las condiciones del clima, o sea, la temperatura, la infraestructura, y bueno, al final fue una selección también a conveniencia por pues tener pues cierta infraestructura también nosotros con el Tecnológico Monterrey, algunos campos que están ubicados, salvo en el caso de Veracruz, ¿no? Entonces, fue una combinación de ello y esperamos que pueda también reflejar ciertas diferencias, ¿no? También hay un punto muy importante y es que el estudio se hace para zonas urbanas, nosotros no estamos entrando a zonas rurales, entonces hay otras metodologías para explorar las necesidades y este tipo digamos, de definiciones en esos otros contextos, ¿no? Entonces, actualmente nos enfocamos en esa zona urbana y buscamos también sí tener una base de referencia para ver cómo se actualizaba este estándar y los costos, pero también agregar algunas ciudades donde hubiera diferencias potenciales, ¿no?
Laura.
Gracias. Para complementar la respuesta de Cristian, que es excelente, vi la pregunta por escrito y saltó en mí, porque yo soy profesora y una de las clases que doy es métodos de investigación. Y es una de las cosas que explico. Cuando vemos métodos de investigación, en un mundo ideal tendríamos recursos ilimitados, tiempo ilimitado, número de personas, investigadores involucrados ilimitado. Pero en la realidad no sucede así. En la realidad esta es una respuesta meramente académica, ¿no? En cuanto a cómo se definen los casos en investigación. Pero en la realidad es un balance entre dónde podemos obtener el mayor beneficio, la mejor información que tenemos con los recursos y el tiempo que tenemos. Entonces, como Cristian mencionó, en este caso ese estudio se concentra en zonas urbanas, teniendo en cuenta la facilidad de las instalaciones y del equipo que en la practicidad nos llevan a tener un proyecto, porque si la alternativa es pensar esto es tan complejo y México es tan grande y tan diverso que es no hacer nada porque no podemos, es mejor tener algo sólido en una base urbana, reconociendo que México es tan variado y tan diverso y las zonas urbanas o ciudades pequeñas o comunidades indígenas tendrían en sí una dinámica diferente y requieren una investigación en sí con un diseño propio y una investigación propia.
Gracias, Laura. Abigail, Fanny Lopez wants to know, how hard has it been in the UK convincing businesses and other social actors to integrate MIS into their decision making?
Thank you. Again, a really interesting question. I think Matt talked about this in the interview, that a lot of the people who are using it, we don't always know how widely it's used. We sort of come across things when people get in touch, or we just hear through other means. It's really been very widely adopted. I think in 2008, when it first came out, as we said, we didn't know how successful it would be or whether people would think it was credible. And we certainly didn't know that we would be able to continue doing it. And I think that is one of the things that has really helped it gain ground in the public consciousness. And the Living Wage Foundation has done such amazing work in building the community around the living wage of employers. So there's now more than 14,000 employers. When the video was shot, it was 10,000. So that number's growing all the time, and they're big employers, they're big companies. And through the work we're doing now with WageMap as one of 6 organizations looking at living wages globally, the work that we're doing together on that will mean that this is something that really is going to be such a fundamental part of so many people's lives. There's a lot of big corporations really looking to pay a living wage across their supply chain, not just where their headquarters are, but throughout all of the dealings that they have with different companies and individuals. And that's going to be huge. So it's taken time. It didn't all happen instantly, but it's very rewarding. And you can see how we can tell the story from that first original project, how these things are built on each other, and the wider recognition and the greater use and the more impact it has. So that's really good to see. And I hope for that for you. I'm confident that that's something that you will be able to see as well.
Thank you, Abby. La siguiente pregunta creo que igual para Laura y para Cristian. Empezando con Laura. Patricia García pregunta, desde la responsabilidad social empresarial y otros datos iniciales, ¿qué sugieren priorizar en la agenda para dignificar a las y los colaboradores en México?
Empiezo. Creo que es este tipo de trabajo, pero también otro tipo de evidencia, ¿no? que se ve alrededor del mundo. Hay ciertos elementos que los trabajadores dicen es importante. Una parte es el sueldo, el pago en sí, pero también hay elementos que son no monetarios, como los horarios laborales, la carga de trabajo, las diferencias de género, la disparidad de género que se reduzca o se combata. Son la facilidad, por ejemplo, de compaginar familia y trabajo. La gente que tiene hijos pequeños, el poder salir si está enfermo, si llaman del colegio que el niño se ha caído y se ha accidentado. Ese tipo de cosas que no son tangibles, pero es parte de la cultura empresarial y que van mucho más allá del elemento monetario. El sistema de transporte, la facilidad de acceso en grandes ciudades como Monterrey, Ciudad de México, el no tener que ir más de 1 hora de camino en el tráfico. Son el tipo de cosas que la evidencia dicta que se valoran, ¿no? Dejo a Cristian.
Sí, y coincido con eso, pero creo que es difícil priorizar o dar una respuesta general, porque creo que también este estudio va a permitir también que podamos comparar y saber cómo estamos de pronto en términos de lo que la gente necesita versus lo que de pronto estamos ofreciendo, quizás a nivel país o a nivel estado, a nivel ciudad, y posteriormente también ver dónde puede la empresa tal vez llenar algunos vacíos que ya pues algunas lo hacen, ¿no? Por ejemplo, cuando pagan seguros de gastos médicos mayores, ¿no? O tienen algún servicio médico disponible en las instalaciones. Entonces yo creo que es difícil como dar una receta. Lo importante, y creo que no sé si se mencionó en algún momento, es que este va a ser un proceso y tal vez relacionado a la pregunta de convencer. Sabemos que el resultado, lo que publiquemos con este estudio, es solamente el inicio, ¿no? De un proceso y habrá que comunicar. Así que, pues nuevamente por eso era hace un rato la invitación a que se quedaran sintonizados, ¿no? Pero sé que tenemos una última pregunta ya casi para el cierre.
Sí, just some closing remarks. Abby, we'll start with you. And just in general, another question that was here, Karen wanted to know how we take into account stuff like security, social relationships between people and such. Just as a final note, and give way to your closing remarks for today.
Okay, thanks. The security is what people talk about when they think about different aspects of their lives. So it's having a secure home, it's also having a secure job, it's having a secure income, So security is a big feature, and some of those things are practical steps. So whether you need to be able to have a strong lock on your front door, or things that, you know, keep you safe, or whether it's about the quality of work that you should be able to have within your society, and the access you need to get to that work. And that includes the considerations around educational opportunities, as well as the physical aspect of transport, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of quite complex elements to something like security that people talk about in different ways. And those will sort of be reflected in the discussions and in the write-up. So even if they're not tangible things that we can price up and put a cost for in the budget, there are things that you can reflect in the report about people's feeling of the importance of security and being able to feel safe in their homes, and so on and so forth. I would just like to say a huge thank you to Christian and Carlos and Laura, and for putting on this event and giving me the opportunity to attend. It's been such a privilege and a pleasure to work with you all and the team. And I know that it's going to have fantastic results, and I'm really excited to see how it all comes out. And as you know, if there's ever anything we can do to help and support you in that, then we will be more than happy to do so. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Laura?
Muchas gracias. Yo creo, voy a reflexionar algo muy corto primero sobre enfatizar este diálogo entre la empresa, el gobierno, la sociedad civil es clave, porque cualquier resultado que salga de qué es lo que necesitamos los mexicanos para vivir mejor o para tener una vida digna, es necesaria esta colaboración. Y el otro, que es mi otra reflexión, que es un poco más larga, es que la metodología en sí tiene un impacto, digamos, empoderador de la gente. Siempre uso el mismo ejemplo, pero recuerdo muy bien en uno de los grupos que hicimos, en los primeros grupos, en el piloto que hicimos en Monterrey, la gente estaba hablando de qué necesita tener una casa para que sea de forma digna. Y había discusiones muy largas, grandes debates, y en este caso estaban hablando del suelo y toda la justificación de por qué es importante piso firme, por cuestiones de salud, por cuestiones de temperatura, etc. Después dieron paso a hablar sobre la necesidad de tener cortinas o persianas. Igual, y entonces la gente decía, es importante tener cortinas o persianas por seguridad, por privacidad, por poder tener tiempo familiar, por temperaturas. Daban todos los motivos de por qué son necesarias. Y una persona en el grupo dijo, es que entre tener cortinas o tener suelo firme, mejor que tengan suelo firme. Y otra persona en sí, este es lo empoderador o cómo se regula en sí el grupo. Otra persona dijo, pero es que si las dos son necesarias, no tendrían por qué elegir. No tendrían por qué tener que elegir entre suelo o cortina. Si el suelo firme es necesario porque te da salud, te da seguridad, regula la temperatura del hogar, y las cortinas también son necesarias, las dos deben de ir en esta canasta. Las dos deben de ser incluidas si las dos son necesarias. Y y fue como empoderador. La gente dice, bueno, si las dos son necesarias, ¿por qué elegir? Podemos tenerlo, deberíamos de poder tenerlo. Y después entrarían las discusiones de cómo lograrlo, ¿no? Pero creo que es una metodología fascinante. Y una vez más, final, gracias. Thank you very much, Abby. It's good to see you. Gracias, Cristian. Gracias, Carlos. También seguimos y doy paso.
Listo. Cristian, ¿qué sigue para la investigación? Ya para cerrar.
Sí, justo me fijaba en la última pregunta de Elisa, que habla de cómo tropicalizar los consejos y estrategias. Nosotros contemplamos que este estudio se termine o completemos el estudio para junio del próximo año. Y también dentro del proyecto contemplamos toda esta fase de comunicación, de diálogo, de socialización de los resultados, porque sabemos que pues habrá diferentes actores que tendrán diferentes aspectos que aportar pues a las soluciones y las formas en las que vamos a poder aplicar estos hallazgos, ¿no? Entonces, pues nada más pues quisiera invitarlos a que sigan sintonizados con pues nuestros aliados del Centro Eugenio Garza Sada y con el Centro de Empresas Conscientes también, para que puedan estar entonces actualizados de todo lo que sigue en ese proceso de pues, comunicación y trabajo con los hallazgos. Y pues agradecerle a nuestros partners de la Universidad de Loughborough, a Abby, Laura, Matt, que no pudo estar, y bueno, nuevamente a ti, a Carlos, y bueno, a todos en el centro.
Muchas gracias a todas y todos por estar con nosotros hoy. Gracias por su paciencia al principio. Quédense, pues síganos y quédense conectados con lo que se está haciendo desde el Centro de Empresas Conscientes del TEC de Monterrey y de la Iniciativa Capitalismo Social. Habrá mucho más conversación alrededor del tema, como ya vimos, requiere una conversación profunda entre actores, así que estaremos en ello. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y que tengan una gran semana.
Gracias.